Come on, Twitch. Wake up. No, this is taking unusually long. Alright, there we are. So I'll go tell the world. Streaming indie dev. Gonna do spaceship stuff, I think. Paste. As you might be able to tell, I'm feeling really tired today. I might be coming down with something. Don't worry, you won't catch it through the microphone. But definitely not at my A game. Alright, so that should be that. Let's just switch back to here and we'll get started. In the last episode where we streamed, what I did was stream the development of additional levels, or one additional level. And we had to spend a lot of time undoing everything I did because my brain wasn't working too well then either. My brain doesn't work too well when it's dark and rainy for 6 months straight. So, yeah, my brain still doesn't work because, as you might be able to hear, it's dark and rainy, and it will be dark and rainy until June. Great. Maybe I will move to the desert. So what are we going to do today? Well, there are a lot of things I want to do. And last week I talked a little bit about the idea that a lot of these assets are intended for reuse, or at least that's the theory, right? But what I've done is I have created a situation where these assets don't look the way they need to look in order to be reusable. Now, I've talked a lot about spaceship stuff, and one of the big issues we've got with spaceship parts and reusability is simply that if you have very detailed parts, your spaceships end up as unreadable garbage. And if you have very basic parts, your spaceships end up looking like tinkered toys. So reusability, you have to consider exactly what kind of reusability you're talking about. Because if you're building modules, like I am, then they have to be able to combine in ways that feel good. And if you do that with generic parts, then you're going to end up with either all of your parts feeling very, very primitive, or all your parts feeling way too gothic and overdone. Combine that with the fact that there's functionality involved, like this is actually an engine, or this is actually a gun, or this is actually a place where you live, and that sort of stuff. Now, what I was trying to do originally was I was working out the idea that I would be able to greeble these parts independently using some kind of mesh greebler. But I don't think that's a very good approach. And I think that there is a serious set of flaws based on that kind of ideal. So what I was thinking about doing today is maybe designing... Alan Wyvern says that it sounds pretty shit, and hello. Hey, Al. So I think what I was trying to do today is maybe I would design some spaceship parts with a new kind of concept. So unless anybody has any strong feelings about what they would like me to do, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pop on over and tell Twitter that that's what I'm doing in specific, I guess. I'll be doing spaceship concept art today. Tweet. There we go. So what we're going to do just for a second while I open up my art program and get everything situated is I'm going to switch over to Phoenix Wright. Boom! Objection! Just because there's a lot of annoyances in getting this up and running, and there are some projects I'm not allowed to show you on camera, or off camera, I guess. Contracts are like that. And it takes forever to open this today. I wonder why. I guess streaming interferes with it. Oh, it's because I opened ZBrush instead of my Paint program. I actually could do some spaceship modeling in ZBrush, but it would take me all day because I'm not really proficient in speed with ZBrush yet. This is more like it. So let's create ourselves a nice big canvas, something like that. And then we will just pop on over here and switch it back over to the screen. Hooray! Exciting stuff. I know. And we'll go ahead and start to pull out our tablet and we'll doodle. Move some stuff around. I didn't expect to be streaming art because I am not really thinking ahead very carefully today. Anyway, here we are. So what we're going to do is we're just going to sketch up some spaceship stuff in black rather than white. And this is something that you can see all the time. I'm going to try and just choose a pencil that feels pencil-y. That one will do. So one of the basic issues we've got is that when you chop up a spaceship into modules, like say, core, cockpit module, and then, storage module, and then, engine module, that sort of stuff. Each of these modules can be combined in different ways depending on how the player wants to build their ship or how the dev wants to build a new custom ship. And with modules, that's very handy, but the issue is that the modules have to interlock and play nice and look like they make sense. The core problem with that is that means that all of the modules end up feeling very similar, and you don't end up with the right kind of spaceship design. And the right kind of spaceship design is one where you have open and closed spaces, or dense and free, or whatever you want to call it, right? So you have two planes on your spaceship. You want one of them to be greebled and interesting, right? And you want the other one to be quite basic. And that's how you get your spaceship to feel correct. And now normally what this does, what you do when you're building this in your own custom spaceship design is you'll have a part of your spaceship that is largely ungreebled, and then you'll have a rising or falling level of greebling, and then you'll have another part of your spaceship which is heavily greebled, and you may or may not go back to the other level of greebles, or you may just continue. And this creates a nice kind of eye fluff, like your eye will cross across the ship, and it will feel good because you see these areas where your eye can slide, and you see these areas where your eye gets caught up. And now there are a couple of other ways to do this. If you're part of the Apple spaceship design philosophy, then you do this with just lines of color rather than greebles. But I think that I want to use greebles because modules work best when there is some topological chaos, because otherwise you end up having to make the modules fit together. So if you're just going to do line work, then you have something like this, right? And you've got this cool line that makes them feel good. But in order for this line to make sense, it's got to continue on the next object. And now you've locked yourself into having to come up with some algorithmic way to define those lines after the ship has been assembled, or you have to have some way to have that line in the modules, and then you've limited how the modules can lock together. Creating an algorithmic idea for having this line, that's something I can do. I can paint lines onto ships, but it makes a lot more sense for us to just use greebles, because that also hides any differences in the kinds of modules you're using. And the whole point is that you may mix and match modules from different sets, and then you'll end up with modules that don't quite fit together, but it should be close enough that you will end up, feeling like it's something that makes sense, right? So we're looking at stuff like this, and what I'd like to do is think about a couple of greebling concepts, how to make spaceship parts that feel like they are proper. And that's going to be something you can already see right here. We've got an ungreebled part, we got a stage of rising greebles, and then we got some heavy greebles. Now, obviously, this is a very, very basic sketch, so, you have to use your imagination, I guess. But the point here is that there are ways in which we can use modular elements to enforce greebling and to hide greebling. So if this element here is available as a module, that can have other modules stuffed in it. So it's like a, a curtain module, an armor module, something like that. Then you end up with a very natural area that is largely ungreebled. And then these things in here, they have a ton of greebles, but they're always going to be stuck into something or onto something. And that means that you end up with a lot more, that you end up drifting into them. They're not just bang, always there. That you drift into them because you're coming into a containment. So in the previous set of ships that I created, and this is really what I was getting to, sorry if I'm moving slow, I'm kind of thinking as I go here, I would have these structural elements. I don't know why I put a little thing at the end there. There we are. I'd have these structural elements like beams or whatever, and then you'd put modules onto them, right? Now, the problem with that approach is that the modules you put onto them are largely undifferentiated, which means they might be greebled or they might not be greebled, depending on what the player needs in the design of the module. And then, if I wanted to have ungreebled areas, what I would do is I would have floating armor plates that you could staple on top of the ship. And those never really worked out very well because they don't naturally get along. Alan Wyvern says, what about greebling as a kind of submodule of their own? I've actually tried to do that, but the problem is the topology of the modules doesn't feel right, and I'll talk about that in a second here. These floating armor plates never quite felt right, because in order for them to feel like they're properly embracing the modules or shielding the modules, they have to kind of slot in around the module, and since every module has its own shape and might be configured in a different way, might be drifted off to the side or whatever, it's very difficult to get armor that works. So what I was thinking is that instead of that, we would do the opposite, and we would have a containment system where you would have a variety of things that act as structural elements on the ship, and you can stick your objects inside of them. So you've got your greebled stuff coming out the back here or coming out the sides here or whatever, right? And in this way, you have a situation where you've got your armor plating, and you can import armor plating from other ship module elements. And you don't have to worry about, I don't have to worry about trying to get the ship to flow nice, because it's naturally got these containment units, and the containment units naturally have flow because you're sticking things in them. So naturally they're going to flow in a specific way depending on how I've made them stickable, right? Now, there still are some things I need to do in addition to that, like, for example, this thing that I don't know if you remember the original sketch, there was something up there that was ungreebled. These largely ungreebled areas I'll talk about in a second. Because Alan Wyvern says, what kind of greebling, what about greebling as a sub-element? And that's actually something I implemented, but it's quite difficult for two reasons. The first is that you need to have the greeble stick to the surface of the module in a relatively convincing way. So if you've got something like this, let's say you've got a rocket engine, right? And I might say that the default rocket engine is largely ungreebled, because that makes sense. If you're going to greeble on the fly, then you obviously want your greeble, your base structure to be ungreebled, because you're going to be adding greebled, right? So there's your rocket engine. Now, if you want to add greebles to that as a secondary module, you've got this curved surface. And so you either have to have a line of greebles, which is not so bad, but has the same problem on other modules that don't happen to have a linear surface like this, or you need to have greebles that somehow track to the shape of the circle. And that's a little bit difficult. You have to either distort the mesh, or you have to build your greebles such that they are like flat modules, like say this, for example, that happen to have a curved interior element, so you can sink them, not necessarily a curved element, but a depth to them, so that you can sink them into curved elements. And then what you end up with is an engine that would look something like this, right? You'd have this, and then you'd have coming out and then becoming a flat element. And there's nothing wrong with that, except that it ends up feeling very, very clunky, and at some point these greebling modules become aggressively independent. Like, you're putting in dozens of them, and you've got to have them built into some kind of automated system, and then you've got to worry about whether or not they make sense. And there's also modules that are naturally going to be greebled. Like, am I going to build an ungreebled radio dish? Am I going to build an ungreebled laser cannon? I could, but it would be a bit of a struggle. I think I will be including modules like this, but I don't want them to be the focus. I'd like the player to be able to build their ship without worrying about greebling, and it just looking fantastic. And that means I've got to have a good flow. Now, the flow is core to this whole idea, but the whole point here is that good spaceships have a specific kind of flow. It doesn't matter whether they're just giant floating space penises or whether they're something complicated like Firefly or whatever other things you've got going for you, Star Trek ships. They all have this flow, which is an organic sweep to the ship. And I believe that every famous starship has this same organic sweep. It's not necessarily the shape of the ship. It's the shape that your eye follows when you're looking at the ship. So obviously the Enterprise has an organic set of shapes because it's literally curved like this, right? And that gives you this wonderful flow where your eye goes whoosh. But if you have a ship that is less flowing, you can still have some really good and organic feels. A good example of that might be the X-Wing, right? It doesn't really have any flowing organic curves or anything. It's a very straight ship. But the way that it works, the way that your eye flows across it ends up with this same sort of whoosh. So you end up with basically a sort of pacing to the way you look at the ship. And this is kind of like, you can argue that I'm just talking out of my butt, but this is the sort of thing I'm aiming to do, whether or not I'm talking out of my butt or not. I'm aiming that such that the player, when they create a ship, naturally creates a ship where their eye goes, whee! That is what I want out of this modular system. The problem is that modules inherently don't work like that. Because the whole point of a module is that you can put it in anywhere, and it will just do whatever it's supposed to do. So this pattern is no good. And that's why I need to introduce, whether or not I decide to do surface greebling or not, I still need to introduce a kind of structural flow to these ships. And that means that I've got to understand the way the player is going to build their ships before the player does. I have to put out these structural elements and be like, okay, so the player is going to build it like this, regardless of whether I tell them to or not. And so then I'm going to have that make sense. Now the containment units, and so far I'm using the same shape over and over and over, but I'll have a whole bunch of different shapes. The containment units are a fine idea, especially if they've got some complexity like this side cutout, because then you can do more complicated things with this, like have a sticky outie bit that is one of these modules, right? And that would look really neat. But that sticky outie bit could also be another containment unit, maybe of a different ship or a different size or something, right? And then you can have double containment fun. So here's the same unit stuck inside of itself, just scaled a little bit differently, right? So by having these sorts of cutouts, you can naturally guide the player into not just creating one shape of ship. And that's the key. These structural elements are not there to force the player to build the specific ship I want them to build. They're there to give the ship a kind of structural feel that the eye can slide along. But them alone, that's not going to be enough, because if every functional element is heavily greebled, then it doesn't matter what's going to happen. If the only thing that's not greebled is this, it's going to feel really, really blunt. So what we need is some other elements here that have an ungreebled sort of look to them. And these elements can be notched in however you'd like. So in the original version of this, for example, I made like this box shape, and then I did this, and then I did this, and then I had the greeble stuff, right? And that's fine. But another option would be to start like this, and then have the box here, and then have a whole bunch of greeble stuff, right? One of these things looks more phallic than the other, but the point is that you can do this any way you please, and it will still flow really nicely. So that is the idea. We want these ships, you can arrange them however you want, but if I choose the right sort of elements, you're naturally going to build ships that flow, and that means I've got to have some containment units, I've got to have some low greeble objects which also have containment properties, and then I need to have some high greebled objects. So a good sort of thing for that would be if this front module that I've been sketching as a box is a cockpit, right? Because you don't have heavily greebled cockpits most of the time. But the problem is that a cockpit has directionality to it. So if it is a, like a cockpit where you're sitting in a space fighter or something and you're looking out the front, you're being like, oh, I'm going to shoot some lasers. Psew, psew, psew. Well, I can't put that inside of one of these containment units because you'll be like, hello? Hello? I can't see. And that's really not a great solution. So some of these units they have to be in a specific place, and that's going to be a challenge. Of course, engines have the opposite problem. They're faced backwards, and you don't want to put other shit behind them, or you'll explode. So these sorts of situations make it a little bit difficult to give you the sort of freedom that you might want in your design. One particular option is to just ignore it. So if we have ourselves a cockpit, we can have it have, a window like this. But if we say that it's, mostly HUD driven and the window is there, just for appearances or whatever, then what we can do is we can still stick it behind something or inside of an armored shell or whatever. And you just say, okay, yeah, it doesn't really matter. You can put it wherever you want. And then, your basic greebling, this is a low greeble product, so it's got something like that, right? Very, very basic setup. You can either put it inside of something or you can put something inside of it or whatever. And then you've got the opportunity to have something connecting to the cockpit back here, or something connecting around the cockpit back here, or something connecting around the cockpit up here. You've basically got a few options. So if we look at this from the back, a standard setup might be something like this, right? Where you've got a hole and then, there's like a module marker here where the player can be like, oh, there's there's a spot, there's a plug there, and I can stick any matching module in there. And so they'll, put in some kind of extra module. The problem is that this module is fundamentally going to have to flow. And that's not a natural thing for this to have happen. I'm picturing things in my brain faster than I'm drawing them, and that might not be very easy to watch, sorry. Let's just go ahead and draw ourselves a quick little sketched up ship, right? So we've got ourselves a cockpit, and we'll give our cockpit some shape like this, just because that way we have an interesting connection element down in the back. Which can allow us to get some nice flow optionally as the player decides how they're going to implement their ship design, right? So if we have a ship like this, we may also have like an antenna or something coming off the back. Now this is something where you wouldn't enclose the backside in a containment unit. You might enclose the front side, but let's just keep drawing for a little bit because one of the things that we have to think about is how this moves into the body of the ship. And the way I've drawn before is where we have a containment unit that's substantially larger than the cockpit, or at least substantially more flowy than the cockpit. Whether it's larger or whether it's just flowier is the same basic setup. The whole point is you're moving out of the cockpit's setup and into a more transitionary element. So this is clearly a transition element. It's got a flow, and it's got a low greebled setup, and then we've got stuff in the back here. So if this is just supposed to be, say, a cargo liner, what we might have is a heavy engine core, something like this, right? Where we've got a setup where it's some kind of engine that comes back and has a rear-facing setup, but it's a big engine. Now, the key to this big engine is that it is heavily greebled. It is not a low contrast area. This is a highly greebled setup, which allows us to add in a lot of those extra details that would otherwise that wouldn't fit when they were right behind the cockpit. Now I'm just doodling random greebles, but this would also have to have cargo space, right? So where would you put that? And is cargo a high greeble or a low greeble setup? Well, I guess it could be either, right? Because you could have cargo be boxes, oops, or you could have cargo be some kind of cool, tooth-like arrangement. where it's storing things inside of clamps and stuff like that, and that could be fun. And it could give you a lot of high greebled sort of situations. But how do you attach that to this flow? Now, in the previous kinds of ships that I've built, what you would do is you would literally just staple it on the outside. So you'd just say, oh, well, here's a cargo box. Boom, right? Now, that's not a good idea anymore. That's not what I want anymore. What I'd like to see instead is a cover element, some kind of containment unit to get the flow to feel right. And I think that what you can do is simply add in another one of these, maybe a scaled down one, or maybe it's a full size one. Let's go ahead and make it a full size one just to see how that looks, right? So you would just slide it back a little bit. And maybe you'd put the little divot on top this time, right? Just to give you a little bit of variety. And then you can put the cargo inside of this. And that means that we can have a cargo element that is a core structural element. Or at the very least, we can have an element which contains the cargo modules. And either one of those would work. Let's go ahead and say that we've got something like this. And then there is just cargo box greebling all the way down like this, right? So we've got a sort of setup where these cargo boxes are high greebled situations, and they're inside of some kind of containment unit. And maybe there is some kind of really, really dense greebling at the end for the for the docking mechanism and the clamps and stuff. However we want to draw it, there's no particular reason to be too careful. But you can see that this ship here looks like a spaceship. It flows like a spaceship. You get the feeling that there is some nice design behind it because your eye naturally flows, and that is the key to how I want these spaceships to feel. And because of that, I've got to be able to build modules that do this. And that is the hard part. It's like, I want the player to be able to do whatever they want, but I also need these modules to feel like they're creating flow. And I think that this concept of containment units is just a natural, better fit. But there are a lot of modules that feel like they should be surface units, like a radar. You got this dish, this antenna. Is that really going to be, a module that gets stuck inside of a structural element, or is it just stuck onto the front, onto the surface? I think that it has to be its own module. I think what we'll need to do is have these kinds of modules as actual structural modules. The problem is, of course, that at some point they start to stack up in ways that don't make sense. So, for example, we've got our cargo module, right, and it's something like this. In the actual 3D model, it's something like this. And there's a lot of greebling here, right? And then there's probably something here, who knows? And that's basically how our cargo module looks. If we have another module that's for this, exactly how does it fit in? Is it exactly the same size? Because if it's exactly the same size, then that's a pretty strong constraint on the sorts of ships you're going to be reading, especially if you're importing different ships from different from different catalogs. You've got a module from ship type A and a module from ship type B, and you want to be able to combine them. They're not going to be the same size all the time. That would just be really boring if they were. If you have it as a different sized module, though, you run into this issue where it will look a little bit strange depending on how it's built. And this is especially true if the ships are, if the ship modules are all different shapes. So here, for example, in this sketch, these look like two circles, but they're not really two circles because the cargo module is a truncated oval like this. And who knows, the radar module might be something else that's more interesting, like a double bounce circle. Let's not go with that shape. Let's go with like a rounded rectangle, right? Something in the opposite direction. And as you get more and more unique shapes, it becomes more and more difficult to fit them inside of the containment units, which have a specific shape. And that also becomes more and more difficult to see how they fit together in any sort of decent way. Combining them becomes very difficult. And this is the core of the issue with modules, is how do you get them to fit together? In the current setup, this ship here, this ship here, the issue is that the ship looks is just jumbled. It's just a giant mishmash of parts. Now this is with all of the additional plugins turned off, so this is just like the starting ship. Now there's nothing wrong with a giant mishmash of parts. This particular ship does have some flow to it because of the way that I use blue and gray. Just like I said earlier, you can use colored lines, and that's what I'm doing. But it would be better if it felt less crap, and the player would be able to design it, at least in the long run. And that means that I've got to come up with very flexible ways to do it. And another factor is that these have to be ways that allow me to use other modules from other asset sets, so that I don't have to continually rebuild every single module, and I can just say, okay, well, let's use one of those older modules. So basically, I need to have a way to create containment and flow for these modules, these already pre-existing modules. And that means that they're not nice round shapes. They've got all sorts of lumps and stuff, and I want to stick with that. I want all of these things to have their own interesting shapes. That's the point of greebles, right? So if I've got something like this, I want to be able to plug in that complicated double barrel option that you saw. I want to be able to plug in this thing here that you're looking at right now. And in order to do that, I've got to make sure that that kind of shape can fit into the containment unit, even though the containment unit was not designed to take it. And that's something that is maybe a little bit high-hopey, but I think that it's going to work out, because if you give these containment units some kind of unique element, like this hole here, then the players will be able to align their stuff to slide through that element or around that element, and in that way it'll look intentional. So that way we'll be able to create a sort of forgiving pattern. Whether or not it makes structural sense is largely irrelevant, as long as it makes sense to the flow of your eye. And then of course you can put the cargo module right here on the back, right? And it should make, if not sense, it should look decent. And that's because of the greebling that we're building into the cargo module, where it's got this high density and this low density greebling area, and that creates a nice natural flow. But then if you put the engine on the back of there, you can see how when you just stack it up like a Kerbal column, it probably won't work. And that's why I need to make sure that the containment units are something that the player will want to use. The player will want to build with them. And to some extent, I think that's going to be a matter of, yeah, these things are armor. So while you may not be intending this thing for combat, you are going to want to make sure that you don't just get blown up by any random piece of space dust in your path, right? But I also think that it might be worthwhile to consider other options like structural integrity penalties and stuff like that. Haven't really got that part figured out, but the core idea here is I need to create some containment units. So let's do that. All right, so if we go over into our set here, we're going to want to go into these meshes and create ourselves some new ship parts. So we've got ship parts 01 here, and what we're going to do is we're actually going to go ahead and save that as a different file. I am once again going to switch you to Phoenix Wright just for a moment. Oh, good. It didn't matter. So that's going to be, what are we going to call it? We'll call it Fenders. Now, Fenders is just going to contain a lot of generic parts that we can use to create our greebled ships. And then we're going to have to go through and create a whole bunch of elements for it, right? But we'll go ahead and start with a circle. And try and go to the circle, thank you. and then we'll rotate it. Oh, edit mode and rotate it by 90. No, come on. There we are. And there are actually things like half spheres and stuff, but I don't want to use it for that just yet, so we're going to go ahead and do it like this. There we are. So we'll just create ourselves a half sphere using extrusion for the moment. Now, what I want to do is create a nice beveled element here, and I think that I'll want to do it on a 0.5 like that. So that's at a 0.5 limit, and that should be good for the sake of creating something nice. We're going to want to delete half of this, like this, and create a mirror modifier, like so. Go ahead and add in some clipping, and then fill that. And we're going to want to just shrink this down a tiny bit and create ourselves a nice groove, a hole. And I think that that's a good size for it, although I'm kind of just guesstimating. But I think I need to move all of these, so hold on just a moment. Been a while since I've used Blender, pardon my clumsy fingers. There we are. And we're going to want to extrude all of this inwards. Now the problem with this basic approach is that right now if we just try and scale it, it's going to look silly. So what we're going to do is we're going to switch towards extruding towards the 3D cursor, because if we scale on the 3D cursor, you can see that that ends up with a nice circular scale. If we hit Shift Y, there it is, we can block it from scaling on the Y-axis, which in turn means that it won't go towards that in that direction. Instead, we'll just get this set up. But this isn't perfect because these are dented inwards, as you can see. See that? How they're coming in? They're not flat. So what we actually need to do is adjust this so that that is a nice, fairly flat setup. And the two ways of doing that are adjusting it on the inside and adjusting it on the outside. So let's go ahead and switch back to median mode. And if we scale it up on the inside, we end up with something like this. And that's not too bad. We can just adjust it until it's roughly circular. It doesn't have to be perfect. And then what we'll want to do is take all of these elements here and extrude them. Now, we already know that it's a 0.5 distance, so that lines us up just perfectly. And then if we remove the doubles, we'll remove these two verts, and we'll end up with a nice sealed element. And then extrude down. Oh, go back towards extruding towards the 3D cursor so it ends up smooth. And then we'll just dent it in, and then extrude, and dent it in, and then fill it. Yeah, like that. That's fine. So that is our most basic containment module, right? Let's go ahead and set this up so that it looks a little bit more like what we'd like it to look like. And that means that we're going to want to set it up with smooth faces and an auto smooth operator, like so. And that'll give us just a basic sort of setup. But we do have a problem where this is not really as nice and future-y as we'd like it to be. It feels low poly. We're going to go ahead and add a bevel modifier to the entire thing. And this is a dumb trick that doesn't always work. One of the things that's clear is it's not working for these lines up here, and it's creating striations around here, which means that we probably won't be able to use it, even if I would like it to. Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't seem like it's quite nice enough to do it like this. So we're going to just do it manually. And the way we do it manually is pretty simple. We just grab the edge loops that we'd like to bevel, and we bevel them. I know that sounds very complicated. We're going to want to be in line mode for this, because otherwise we'll bevel faces that we don't want to bevel. There we go. And then we're also going to want to bevel here. So we'll grab these, and we might as well grab along the surface, just because otherwise it'll look a little strange. There we go. It's more or less how I want it to look. And then we'll just have to bevel some of these manually. So That curve is pretty pretty rocky. It's not a very good curve. So we're going to go and just try and refine it a little bit. And the idea here is that we don't want any really, really obvious ka-chunks. So we're just going to go ahead and smooth it out until it feels like it's a nice, smooth curve. Oh, that's not where I want that. That's where I want it. And this is adding a lot of extra faces, but that's fine. We can always use a decimate modifier to bring it down for our low level of detail elements. There we go. And now this is a very, very rocky front edge here. It doesn't quite work. We'll just move it and then scale it up on that axis. And we'll have a flat front. That should be fine. And I think that we're going to need to bevel here. There we are. So the only problem left is this edge here is rough. It's apparently too rough to properly bevel. So we're going to want to try and see whether or not we can get that to feel more decent. And the way to do that is to add in a manual bevel. Everything's bevels, you know that. There we are. So if we add in something like that, you can see how that drops it down inside of this edge. And that's the important bit. I don't want it to feel like this edge is going all the way around. But I also would like it to be a little bit smoother throughout. So we'll just keep moving it around until our auto smoothing works. And it looks like there is a problem down here, which I don't understand. Why is there a problem down there and not up there? Well, it must be a floating point difference, or this is not as even as I thought it was. Yeah, look at that. This is not centered. It got uncentered. Oh, no. Oh, because this is uncentered. God damn it. Somehow, at some point, I clicked and ended up not having our center point at our center point, and that's going to cause us annoyances, I'm afraid. So we're going to go ahead and re-extrude this interior face. It's not a big deal. In fact, it might be even easier than it was before. There we are. So let me extrude again. And then we extrude again. And then we extrude again. And then we seal it off. There we are. That's better. All right. Basic armor setup. This is super, super primitive. In fact, it's a little bit too primitive, so we're going to add just a little bit of greebling. Not enough to make a difference, just enough to make the player notice. And we're going to do that by extruding all of these faces and all of these faces. Just a little bit. The problem is that we've wrapped around to the inside, and we don't want that. So we're going to go ahead and hide these. Boom, like so. And that way when we select these faces, it will not cross across, and we'll just get those faces alone. And we're also going to want to extrude this guy. Oop. So when we do this, we can go ahead and extrude from our center point here, and it should end up looking okay if we just extrude a tiny, tiny bit. Like that. Yeah, that's not too bad. It's not quite right, though. Let's go ahead and try that again. This time we're going to go ahead and try and go from the median point. So the problem with the median point is that these back elements drift. But we can always simply move the entire thing forward, which will give us a nice feel up front where it's heavier. And then in the back, we got this double bump. And I can get rid of it if I need to, but to be honest, I think it actually looks like it means something, like it exists, which is nice. It's a little bit too... This part here doesn't really work. I wonder if I just grab this set and scale them up on the It's a little better. All right. So this is it. This is what we're going to use for our very, very first structural guideline. And this is going to be called, I'm going to call all of these fenders, just because that way I'll remember, I'll be able to find them no problem. So we're going to call this a fender half circle. What do you call them? Half spheres? They're called hemispheres. Zergy says, you have Blender set so you can't see the inside faces. I don't remember. Yeah, backface culling is turned off. Zergy says, and what is greebling? Greebling is details on your ships. So if you look here, these sketches, this part is ungreebled because there's no detail. This part is greebled because there's lots of random details. And the story goes that this was invented by Lucas or Lucas's engineers, I can't remember which, because they have to declare what they're taking through airports. And so they just brought along a box of doodads that they were gluing to their spaceships to add details, and they labeled it Greebles, and that's how it stuck. So the idea behind all of this, everything I've been doing today, is that you want to have some areas of your ships that have a lot of details, a lot of greebles, and we're going to talk about, like, we're talking about real 3D greebles that stick out. We're not talking about just, like, stickers. But you also want to have areas where it's ungreebled, where it's flat and smooth and the eye can sit. And so in order to kind of cause that to just happen naturally as the player is building their ship, we're building a lot of low greeble containment objects, which the player will naturally use to contain their greebled elements and therefore create a nice pattern of ungreebled to greebled, low density and high density. I'm sorry if that's been sitting there for a while, Zargi. I got kind of caught up in my modeling and didn't actually pay enough attention. Sorry about that. So we're going to copy this player ship, and then we're going to go over into our ship planning and then paste it in. That way we have a duplicate of the player's ship, and since it's not a prefab, we don't have to worry about screwing it up. And what we're going to do now is, I forgot to UV unwrap this. We don't really care what the UV unwrapping is. It can be anything, but we need it just for the sake of doing some mathematical operations later on. So this is the ship as it is, and it's just not good enough. And so what we're going to do is we're going to work with our greebling system, or rather our new containment system, and try and create a nice flow. So we're going to go here into meshes. We've got our fenders. Drop our fender in. There it is. And it's obviously not the right material. There's a bunch of stuff wrong with it at the moment, but we're just going to position it in place and see what we can do with it, visually speaking. Let's go ahead and drop in the right material just for, having the right material on it. So, bloop, there we go. And Muvoid came in. Hello, Muvoid. We're testing a new kind of ship planning or ship construction system. So it might be kind of boring to watch because I'm just going to be moving ship parts around for a while. So we're just going to want to... Wow, that's the cockpit. The cockpit has some weird boundary stuff going on. That's fine, though. So the idea is that we would like to have a nice sort of flow, low greebling to high, that sort of thing. And we're trying to get that figured out. Now, this cockpit is ancient, so it doesn't have a good modular connection. But what we can do is we can add in a module there and create a nice sort of connector. I'm just going to go ahead and do that right now with this exact same shape. That didn't work. There we are. And if we rotate it 90 degrees and then shrink it considerably, and then move it back, you could end up with something like that, right? Just to give you the structural idea of what that might look like. It doesn't have to be perfect because we're just fussing around. We're just making some stuff, right? So we've got a lot of structural beams here, which we can use later if we need them. But what I'd like to do is have our engines and our wings fit into this setup, like so, perhaps. And it's a little bit, the gaps in this are a little bit big, but I think that's going to be okay. The real problem is that the wings are too widely set for this. That's not too bad, though. What we'll do is we'll just adjust them a little bit so that they're at -0.5 and 0.5. like so. And that way we get a feel for like those divots mean something, but they are the wrong color. Let's go ahead and just grab the highlight material so that they will fit into this scheme a little bit better. Now, this is one of the free-floating elements that I was talking about earlier. Zargi says, it's been a long time since I checked up on your project. How far along are you? Well, I'll show you. I'll go ahead and save this and then open up the garden. It's not the garden we want. It's the low security area. There we are. So basically, I've got most of the pieces in place. I just have to make a game. But I'm also looking forward to the future because this is, after all, specifically to create the assets I'll need for a more complicated game down the line. So it's already got ship upgrading and a whole bunch of stuff like that. And the whole point of this game is that you're moving through the ship graveyard and you're collecting stuff. You're scanning stuff, you're grabbing debris, that sort of stuff. And so you can see that the details, there's quite a lot of particulate debris and stuff. So we can have a lot of stuff going on. If you hit space, you can do a scan, and you can see what's up. There's a couple of spare parts that we could grab over here. Bonk! I crashed. That's fine. Now the piloting is a little bit weird, and I'm still not convinced that it's great. That the core concept is great. But we'll see. People will get to play it. And this is all available for download, so you can go and play it yourself if you're interested in trying to work through the debris here. You know, collect spare parts. Currently, we're using the least upgraded ship, so it's a bit of a slowpoke. Grab it. But the levels are randomly generated, so every time it's quite a bit different. Zargi says, is this different from the Galactic Line? Well, the Galactic Line is a massive, massive project which requires a tremendous number of spaceship assets and virtual avatars, both of which are quite difficult to create. So I decided what I'd do is I would do two small projects, one for spaceships and one for virtual avatars, and then I would have the knowledge and most of the assets I needed. So this is the spaceship part, because that's the easy one. And it is getting along towards, I don't know about being done, but it's getting along towards being a game. And when I release that, I will go work on the avatar stuff and some kind of relatively small avatar-centric system. I still need to work out how to do avatars really, really well, but I've spent some thought on that, so it should be fun. Oh, well, that's ugly. I think I need to fix this one, because this apparently has a particle stream pointed the wrong way. So I'm looking at the backside of a particle field. Well, whatever. Go back over here into the ship planning element. But as I was saying, this sort of setup looks very primitive, doesn't it? It's a super, super basic ship. And the point is that I would like to have it look a little bit more interesting. And I think one of the most basic ways to do that is to have it be configured in a more interesting way. I'm still going to need to create plenty of more complex modules. The basic set of modules that we're using right now is ungreebled, because I thought I was going to be adding greebles later, and therefore they're very, very basic looking, and that is a shame. That's obviously not gonna fly, but we'll work it out. So if I were to do a trick here, I can shrink this, right? And then I can just move it until it is not inside the engine. No, not quite. It's not going to work. That's fine. But it's actually quite hard to see what's going to happen, because this is such a different paradigm from the way I was building ships. Zargi says, how hard is it to make a project that players couldn't mod previously moddable? Well, that depends, but the answer is not easy. The way in which you do modding in Unity is almost universally that you use asset packs. It's also possible for you to like load from the hard drive directly, but asset packs are more common. The problem is that in order to have asset packs that get grabbed by the game, your game needs to have a method of grabbing asset packs. So unless you've built that in right from the start, it's unlikely that the architecture for grabbing additional asset packs will be there. So that's basically the problem with that. And now if it isn't a Unity project, it's even harder. Unity is actually pretty friendly towards mod setups. So this is one of the things I didn't think of. A lot of these things are forward-facing. So what we're going to need to do is have an idea for what these modules should be for forward-facing elements. So we're going to go ahead and put this aside for now and work on another one, which is going to allow for a forward-facing container. And that's going to be the double containment unit that I sketched up earlier. It's not difficult. So we'll just extrude back. Doesn't matter which way you extrude, the UVs are always going the wrong direction. And we're going to want to cut half of this apart, like so, and add in a mirror modifier. Might as well name it now before we forget. So we're going to call this a fender. What's the thing that you buy in Italian bistros and it's got like white cream stuff in the middle? I can't remember. That doesn't really matter. Sandwich. It's a Fender sandwich. Yay! And now what we can do is we can scale this, and you can see how it doesn't scale evenly anymore. And that's kind of the key towards what I'm trying to do. But it's also scaling the wrong direction, so we're probably not going to use it quite like that. We're going to want to create a couple of cuts here. And we'll create one there, and we'll create one there. And then we're going to want to core out the middle, not for the entire thing, but only for the front and the back, like this. Boom. And we've got some extra fluff on the front and the back that didn't get taken. That's fine. And then what we're going to want to do is reshape it so that it feels a little bit more natural. And, you know, something like that makes some sense. But it's a little bit too round. And what we really want to have this be is kind of square-ish. So what we're going to do is we're going to select this entire set here. And then we're going to turn on projected 2D editing. And then we're going to scale X down like this. And that will create a nice square shape. See? So with that in mind, everything is fine, except that I screwed up and pulled this away from the axis. That's not too bad. We'll just... Whoop, forgot to turn it off. There we go. Boop. Right. So that is going to be the basic of our core, but it's not quite done. We're going to want to add in a little bit of physicality to it by creating some nice elements that, you know, feel like they exist. So we're going to cut here and here, and then we're going to use these to create some divoting like so. That's decent. And then we're going to want to just create a whole shell. So for that, we're going to use Solidify like so. Solidify is naturally very, very thin for some reason. I think 0.2 is probably about right. There we go. And that's a little bit better than trying to extrude it and make it work, just because Solidify does some interesting operations. Problem is that it's going to unmirror us, so we're going to go ahead and you do a UV unwrap before we even get there. There we are. And now we'll apply and apply, and now we've got this set up. Now I could carve away the sides again, but I don't know whether I need to. What I do need to do is make this a little bit more organic. So we're going to just edit the curve of this. I guess I need to select it on every side here. So if we were to create a slightly organic shape to it, which we can do like this, I think it'll feel a little bit more natural. And then back here, we'll do it the opposite direction. Now, one of the things about this is that it is basically a sausage roll, right? It doesn't have any sort of natural connective tissues. And I'll have to think about that. It might be that this doesn't end up working. But we'll go ahead and smooth all the faces and then turn on auto smoothing. And that'll give us sort of just a very basic setup. Now, as before, this is a little bit too uninteresting. So what we're going to need to do is to carve it up in such a way that it has some nice natural feel to it. And that's going to require us to delete a tremendous amount of it after all. I changed my mind, we're deleting it, you know. There we go. I'm going to turn mirroring back on, but for several axes now. There we go. And that way when we carve in the divot we're trying to carve, we'll get a nice mirrored shape. We won't have to worry about doing it manually. So we're going to just go ahead and create this here, and we'll extrude that up. Boom. There. Now I got a very basic shape. And we're going to just unwrap that whole thing again. We could do with a complex material setup. So this could be hull, and then this could be heavy hull. And then what we could do is we could make the interior all heavy hull, right? That's pretty basic. So let's try that again. There we go. And then we'll just do a heavy hull around this edge too. Boom, there we go. And now it's got a little bit of color to it. So let's save that and then see whether or not that's at all suitable for our spaceship. It looks like it has overridden the fenders. That's kind of what I expected to have happen, even though it's not great for usability's sake. So we're going to delete 2 of these and move these out. Boom. So here's the fender sandwich. Let's just see whether structurally it fits into our need. It's scaled up at 1.55, which is a little bit high, so we're going to bring this down. There we go. And you can see how the idea here is that it can kind of serve as a glove for parts that need to point forward. Now, one of the issues we've got is that we've got several parts that need to point forward. Previously, I've just been like, whatever. Obviously, the engine would toast the mechanical arm, but I don't care, right? It makes more sense if we actually have them work, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to drop this engine inside of our fender sandwich. And then we're going to rotate it 90 degrees. And then we're going to move it aside like this. There we are, something like that. That didn't work. I rotated the engine, not the fender, sorry. Try that again. Too many lines, it's hard to tell what's going on. When you have too many lines, it's because you're drawing too many things at once. And you can turn that stuff off in a couple of ways. The easiest way is to select one of these lights that's causing you issues and simply shrink it. And that will allow you to not see the various sort of things that you have to worry about seeing. So now that that's shrunken away, we're no longer getting all of those bright, shiny elements. And that's just an easy trick. You can also go up here and select it from this list and turn it off here. It's the same exact thing. It does precisely the same thing. So there's not a big reason to use one or the other, whichever one's more comfortable for you. Right, so if we do it like this, then we can have it up here, right? Something maybe a little bit like that. And then we can duplicate this, and we can spin it entirely around its axis. Nope, that's the wrong axis. Nope, that's the wrong axis. They're all the wrong axis, obviously. Fine, we'll just rotate it like this. There we are. And then we'll just invert this x coordinate. There we go. And now what we have is a gap in which we can put other things. Like, for example, we can put in a mechanical arm. So if I were to take this last fender sandwich and rotate it, and then put it in the middle, then I could drop our mechanical arm into that fender sandwich. Now, you might notice that this is the wrong shape for the sandwich because it uses a round base. But that round base is just there for kicks. It's just there to mark the fact that this arm exists. It's not fundamentally part of what is required. It's just, in fact, it's just named cylinder. So we can get rid of them and have it come straight out of the containment unit. We can also grab these thrusters and shrink them because they're a little bit too large. So how about 0.6? And in that way, it'll feel like they're not like super overpowered, because now we've got two of them. We no longer need to have the giant overpowered mess, right? And because they're small, we can actually slot them into the center's groove, and it will feel quite natural. So we'll pop on over to the other guy. Paste, and there we are. And that way, we sort of have a setup where the undercarriage of this ship now feels like it could exist, whereas previously it was literally just random garbage. Now, the issue, of course, is that this undercarriage might feel like it exists, but it's still not a very good undercarriage visually. It's very, very primitive. Part of that is the materials in use, but we'll get around to that later on. So this sort of containment element works fine, but those engines are completely ungreebled, which does mean that there's a little bit of silliness going on. Also, we don't quite have anything for this containment up here, so we're going to go ahead and duplicate this again. And we don't need the interior arm this time, so we'll just leave that. And what we're going to do this time is we're going to make this melter, the smelter. It's going to be what we put inside of this unit, like so. And in doing so, you can see how the side gaps naturally form a shell around the smelter, which is one of these things that has a giant front face, which I could probably shrink. I can just close down whatever is causing the silliness. No, I guess there really isn't anything to close down. Maybe that. Well, whatever. I can always just change it to pivot. There, better. And the pivot is in a weird spot for the call welder. There we are. So, we can slot this in and try and find a reasonable space for it. But I think that the best solution is going to be to flip this entire thing over. So we're going to just go ahead and do that real quick. Because I think this short side makes more sense than the long side. There we are, basic setup. Now, because the fender is so straightforward and primitive, it feels okay to have this cockpit mounted on top of it, like so. And because of that, it's a relatively straightforward sort of setup to try and make something that feels, ship-like. The issue is that I'm not sure that this flow is working out, because we've got so many forward-facing elements. I think maybe I need a better forward-facing solution. I'll have to think about it. In the actual game, the full project, Galactic Line, the ships don't have very many forward-facing elements. They don't need them. But in this one, they certainly seem to. Oh, darn it. This guy. Come along for the ride, please. So if we grab this and move it here and shrink it, we can think about exactly what we want to do with that in a minute. I just want to see if it doesn't look too terrible. So these maneuvering thrusters are one of the issues. They are built such that they can be slotted in anywhere, obviously. But the issue is that they are, they really don't look good slotted in anywhere. They need to have themselves slotted in a way that feels natural. And I think that this frame is just the thing for it. So if we were to set up this frame like so, we should be able to move these strafe jetpacks into it and then place them such that it feels quite natural, because they have these gaps, right? But I'm actually not sure. That might not be substantially better. Oh, I know. What happens if we pull them forward so there's gaps behind them? And then we can move them up because they're off center. And then we move this whole thing back. That's a heck of a glow-in-the-dark ship. And then this, we can spin it and move it into this shell here. And since it has a vertical gap, we can sort of claim that that is how the vertical thruster fires. It fires through that vertical gap, right? But that's just visual glitter. It doesn't actually mean anything or change anything. But this whole thing is a little bit large. Let's bring it down. Not that small. I'm just trying to get a feel for whether or not constructing like this makes sense. And one of the biggest problems we've got is simply that the modules that I currently have aren't built with this idea in mind. So it doesn't really feel natural. And you can sort of see that already with the way that this is blocked out like this. There's definitely a feeling like this ship doesn't flow correctly. And a huge part of that is the number of forward-facing elements. All of these forward-facing elements cause our ship to have this giant chaotic nose. And that means that in order to make this feel even vaguely correct, we would need to radically increase the size of all of these background elements here. So if we were to go ahead and just scale everything up from the center, just to see how that would look, right? And then we could put it back like this. Because the core idea is that the body of the ship needs to be larger than all the forward-facing elements, because the forward-facing elements are supposed to only be a small portion of the ship, at least ideally. So we'll just grab here and come on. That's scaling. I just want to move it. And you can see that we've got an issue here where the engine just kind of comes out of nowhere. What we're going to do is we're going to grab this and increase the scale prodigiously. And we're just fussing around trying to figure out what might look decent. Keeping in mind that the colors are terrible, right? We might need to have another kind of setup. Well, I'll think about it some more here. But now we can bring these wings back, which are here. Ooh, I'm getting hungry. I think these side thrusters are a big part of the problem. They're not really, they were intended to fit with ungreebled surfaces, and they're not structural elements, so they're not flowing. But we also have an issue where flowing from this round element here creates this gap, as you can see. So that means that the interior of these might be better off actually being a lot dumber. Let's go ahead and take a quick look and see whether or not that fixes things. If we were to make this interior dumb, would that be better? Let's go ahead and duplicate this and create a dumb version that that makes no sense but might be perfect. And the way to do that is to extrude across, bloop, and then delete. You can, sorry, trying to do this while very hungry for some reason. I'm super starving. We don't need this or this. We certainly, I guess we don't need that, but it's not hurting anything. Oh, I screwed up. There we are. So if we do it like this, then we can simply grab all of these parts. Oh, and extrude, shoop, like that. And we've got some fluff happening. We've got some stuff that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it's not too bad. So if we were to do this, we can just remove doubles, and we should have a contiguous element. And that might be what we need to make this mount feel okay, even when random stuff is being inserted. So if we grab this mesh and we change it over from the Fender Hemisphere to the Fender Hemisphere 1, you can see that that stops having a gap. Now we may want to polish this end up some so that it feels a little bit more natural, but it's definitely better than how it was. But if we do the same thing for the one back here, then it's not going to look right, because what we're doing now is chopping off the actual engine element. That said, if we move the fender itself, we could always pull it back, since these are not supposed to be... the problem is these maneuvering jets. This perfectly ball-shaped container is probably a little bit too round. Let's go ahead and see what happens if we make it a little bit less ball-shaped. Yeah, like that. I think that that'll give us a little bit more natural flow. So I don't even know whether you are seeing what I'm seeing, because I'm thinking about this in a very strange way in comparison to what's actually on the screen here. But I'm trying to figure out a way to have this feel like it's flowing naturally. And the big problem right now is all of this garbage up front, which is just in the way, tremendously in the way. And it's just because there's too much stuff facing forward. I've never liked how ships look when they have stuff on the front, but I obviously need to accommodate it, so I'm not 100% sure what the best approach here would be. However, I do know what the best approach would be for these jump jets, for these jets, and that would be a cylinder with some stuff coming out of it, so that it would fit in well with this Greebold, you know, this new ship that we're building. But I'm getting hungry, and I'm still tired, so I'm thinking about stopping now. It's okay, I've run out of viewers anyway, so I will see you folks on Sunday. I'll probably think about the best way to do this. I may do some work on it off screen, but it's actually a lot easier to think of when I'm talking out loud. So, you know, rubber ducking is a valuable tool, and Twitch makes a pretty good rubber duck. I will see all of you folks on Sunday. Thanks for hanging around.